The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last desperate gamble, a final roll of the dice in the face of an inevitable defeat. It was December 1944, and the Allies had pushed deep into Western Europe, liberating France and advancing toward the heart of Nazi Germany. Yet, with the Soviet Red Army making massive strides from the east and the Allies closing in from the west, Hitler saw his dreams of victory slipping away. In a bid to turn the tide, he concocted a bold plan to break through the thinly held lines of the Allies and split their forces. He hoped to strike at the heart of the American and British forces in the Ardennes, a dense forest region that was believed to be impassable for a large-scale attack. It was here, in the wintry forests of Belgium, that the Battle of the Bulge would unfold. The Germans' plan was audacious and required precision. They had massed over 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of artillery pieces, poised for a surprise attack that would push back the advancing Allies and capture the vital port city of Antwerp. The offensive was intended to cause panic and confusion, forcing the Allies to divide their forces, weakening their grip on the continent. Hitler believed that if he could break through, he could buy Germany enough time to recover, or at the very least, force a negotiated peace with the Western Allies. But in truth, this was a last-ditch effort, born out of desperation. The Allies, particularly the American forces, were caught off guard. With the weather turning frigid and heavy snow blanketing the ground, visibility was poor, and communication between units was difficult. The Germans exploited these conditions, launching their assault in the early hours of December 16th. As the first wave of tanks rumbled through the snow-covered forest, they quickly overwhelmed the few American defenses that were scattered across the region. The Germans made swift progress, exploiting gaps in the Allied lines and pushing deep into enemy territory, creating the now famous Bulge in the front. Among the defenders were American units that had not expected a major offensive in this region. Troops like the 101st Airborne were thrust into the fight, unprepared for the onslaught. The 101st found themselves surrounded in the town of Bastogne, a critical junction at the heart of the German thrust. The German forces demanded their surrender, but the Americans refused. General McAuliffe, who was in command of the 101st, famously responded with one word: "Nuts!" The town became a symbol of American resolve, as the men of the 101st, trapped in the brutal cold with limited supplies, held their ground against the German juggernaut. Despite being encircled, they fought tooth and nail, refusing to yield. As the German forces pushed forward, the situation grew more dire for the Americans. The German tanks, including formidable models like the Tiger and Panther, tore through the snow, creating chaos in their wake. The Americans, however, were determined to hold their ground. Even as their lines were breached and their forces scattered, they maintained a steadfast defense. Soldiers dug in, prepared to fight to the last man if necessary. Their tenacity was further bolstered by the arrival of reinforcements. The weather, which had initially worked in the Germans' favor by grounding Allied air support, was about to shift. The turning point came on December 23rd, when the weather began to clear, allowing the Allies to launch airstrikes on the advancing German forces. The American air power, including the famous P-47 Thunderbolts, hammered the German columns, disrupting their advance and providing much-needed relief to the embattled American troops on the ground. At the same time, General Patton's Third Army, having made a remarkable 100-mile march through snow-covered roads, reached Bastogne to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne. The breakthrough had begun. Despite the best efforts of the Germans, the Allied counteroffensive began to take shape. Patton's troops struck hard at the German flanks, and their relentless pressure began to wear down the German forces. The tanks that had been the spearhead of the German assault found themselves bogged down, unable to advance due to the clearing weather and the increasing pressure from the Allied forces. The once mighty German war machine, which had seemed unstoppable just days before, began to fracture. The Germans, now facing a collapsing front, were forced to retreat. Their dreams of a successful offensive evaporated as the Allies regained control of the region. While the battle was a victory for the Allies, it came at a heavy cost. Thousands of lives were lost, and both sides had suffered crippling losses in men and equipment. For the Germans, It was a devastating blow from which they would never recover. The battle marked the end of their offensive capabilities in the West and sealed the fate of the Nazi regime. For the Allies, the Battle of the Bulge proved that even in the darkest moments, they could stand firm. The courage and determination displayed by American troops in the face of overwhelming odds became legendary. And though the battle was costly, it ultimately brought the Allies one step closer to victory. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a turning point in the war. It was a testament to the resilience of soldiers and the brutality of war itself. The Battle of the Bulge had been a devastating and costly engagement, but it was far from over. While the Allies began to push back against the German forces, the toll of the battle was becoming clear. The remnants of the German offensive were crumbling, but Hitler's high command, unwilling to admit defeat, ordered a strategic retreat and regrouping. The once powerful German war machine had been severely weakened, and with the pressure mounting on both the eastern and western fronts, the Germans began to lose ground rapidly. For the American forces, the victory came at a heavy price. The brutality of the battle had left deep scars on the soldiers who fought it, both physically and mentally. The soldiers who had endured the bitter cold, the constant threat of enemy fire, and the unrelenting nature of the German assault were forever changed. It wasn't just the tanks and artillery that had seen the worst of the fighting. It was the men in the trenches, those who had held on in Bastogne and across the Ardennes, refusing to give an inch even as they faced overwhelming odds. The arrival of reinforcements, including elements of Patton's Third Army, marked a crucial turning point. The weather, which had so heavily favored the Germans early on, began to clear, allowing Allied air superiority to become a decisive factor in turning the tide. Allied bombers and fighter planes, able to fly without obstruction, hammered German positions, disrupting supply lines, and causing chaos within the retreating German forces. The high-altitude bombings, combined with the relentless pressure from ground forces, led to the breakdown of the German offensive. But the German retreat was not without its challenges. Their forces were tired, demoralized, and cut off from supply lines. The once disciplined divisions had become scattered and disorganized, unable to regroup in the face of Allied pressure. With no clear direction, and with the Allies closing in, the Germans were forced to abandon key positions and retreat across the snow-covered landscape, leaving behind their tanks, artillery, and soldiers who had fallen along the way. In a desperate attempt to salvage what they could, the remaining German forces attempted to regroup, but the writing was on the wall. Their days of successful offensives were numbered. In the midst of the retreat, the German soldiers had to contend with more than just the Americans and the weather. The Allies, now emboldened by the victory, pushed forward with relentless precision. The remnants of the German panzer divisions, which had been central to the offensive, struggled to maneuver in the snow and rough terrain. Tanks that had once been a symbol of the German army's might were now bogged down in the icy mud, their engines sputtering out, and their crews retreating under heavy Allied fire. The German tanks, which had been the backbone of their strategy, were now just another casualty of the failed offensive. Meanwhile, the American forces, having held their ground and begun their counteroffensive, were quickly pushing eastward. The battle for Bastogne, once thought to be a lost cause, had proven to be a turning point. The 101st Airborne, along with other American divisions, had held their position against all odds, and now they were on the offensive. The arrival of Patton's forces had broken the siege, and from there, the Allies were able to push back the Germans, reclaiming territory and driving the enemy further into retreat. But the true cost of the Battle of the Bulge would not be measured solely in terrain gained or lost. The human toll was staggering. Thousands of soldiers, both American and German, had died in the frozen, blood-soaked fields of the Ardennes. The battle had been marked by incredible acts of bravery and heart-wrenching losses. In the end, it wasn't just about who had won or lost the battle. It was about the lives lost on both sides and the brutal nature of warfare. As the Germans retreated, the Allies began to rebuild their lines and consolidate their forces. The battle, which had started as a bold offensive to split the Allies and regain control of Western Europe, had failed. The German military, once the dominant force in Europe, was now in full retreat. The Battle of the Bulge had cost the Germans their last chance at turning the tide of the war. For the Allies, it was a hard-earned victory, but one that ultimately paved the way for the final push into Germany and the eventual collapse of the Nazi regime. The Battle of the Bulge had been a defining moment of the Second World War, a testament to the resilience of the soldiers who fought it, and the unrelenting resolve of those who held the line. It marked the last major German offensive on the Western Front, and from there, the Allies would begin their final march towards Berlin, with the fate of the war hanging in the balance. The Battle of the Bulge was more than just a battle. It was a turning point, a moment that shaped the course of history and set the stage for the final chapter of the war. As the German forces continued their retreat, the full scope of the Battle of the Bulge's impact began to unfold. The battle had been one of the bloodiest and most intense engagements of the entire war, and its legacy would be felt for months, even years, to come. The Allies, victorious but bruised, knew that the road ahead was still fraught with peril. Despite the victory at the Bulge, the war was far from over. The German forces, though battered, were not yet defeated, and the Allies had already begun to prepare for the next phase of the conflict. In the aftermath of the battle, the Allies faced the difficult task of regrouping and fortifying their positions. The harsh winter conditions of the Ardennes, combined with the logistical difficulties of supplying their troops, made it a grueling task. The newly reclaimed territory had to be carefully defended, and the troops, many of whom had fought for weeks without rest, needed time to recover. Yet, there was little time to relax, as the momentum of the war demanded that the Allies press forward. For the Germans, the Battle of the Bulge had proven to be their last significant offensive in the West. The failure of the Ardennes offensive meant the Nazis no longer had the strength to threaten the Allied push into Germany. Hitler's decision to risk so much in a last-ditch attempt to reverse the course of the war had proven to be disastrous. Not only had it failed to split the Allies, but it had also resulted in massive losses in terms of both personnel and equipment. The German military was now on the defensive on both fronts, with Soviet forces closing in from the east and the Allies advancing from the west. Yet, the Germans were still far from surrendering. The fight was far from over, and as the Allies advanced into Germany, they encountered fierce resistance from the Wehrmacht. The Nazi leadership, still clinging to a sense of defiance, refused to accept that the war was lost. As the Allies pushed deeper into German-held territory, they faced pockets of stubborn resistance, often from units that had been demoralized and decimated during the Battle of the Bulge. In these final battles, the resolve of the German soldiers was tested to the limit, with many of them refusing to surrender even as the reality of their defeat became clear. The Allies, on the other hand, were emboldened by their success at the Bulge. They knew that the tide of the war had turned irrevocably in their favor. For the American soldiers who had fought so fiercely in the Ardennes, the victory was bittersweet. Many had lost friends, comrades, and brothers in arms, and the memory of the battle would haunt them for years. The experience of fighting in the brutal cold, the constant threat of German tanks, and the desperate last stands of soldiers on both sides would remain etched in their minds. Despite the horrors of the battle, the Allied victory in the Ardennes marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The momentum gained in the Battle of the Bulge allowed the Allies to continue their advance, inching closer to the heart of the Third Reich. The US and British forces would soon link up with the Soviet army in the heart of Germany, a symbol of the unity of the Allied forces and the final collapse of Hitler's war machine. As the war in Europe began to wind down, the Battle of the Bulge remained a defining moment for those who fought in it. For the men who had held the line in Bastogne, endured the fierce tank battles, and withstood the bitter cold, the victory was a testament to their bravery and perseverance. The battle was a microcosm of the larger conflict, a clash of ideologies, a fight for survival, and a test of human endurance in the face of unimaginable adversity. The soldiers of the Battle of the Bulge had not only secured a key victory for the Allies but had also proven that the human spirit could endure even in the darkest of times. The battle had shown that, no matter how dire the situation, it was possible to fight back, to hold on, and to overcome. In the end, it was the determination of the soldiers on both sides, their will to keep fighting, that had shaped the outcome. The Battle of the Bulge was a pivotal moment in history, one that had altered the course of the war and, ultimately, the course of the world. As the war drew to a close, the lessons of the Battle of the Bulge would not be forgotten. The sacrifices made in the frozen fields of Belgium, the bravery displayed by soldiers on both sides, and the sheer scale of the battle's devastation would serve as a reminder of the cost of war and the price of freedom. The Battle of the Bulge may have been the last desperate gamble of a dying regime, but for the Allied forces, it was a clear sign that victory was within reach. As the war in Europe continued to wind down, the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge lingered in the memories of those who had fought through it. The Allied victory, though significant, was bittersweet for the soldiers who had endured the harshest conditions, lost comrades, and faced an enemy that had nothing left to lose. The battle's human cost was immense, and its consequences would ripple through history for years to come. The battle had not only shattered Hitler's last hope of turning the tide of the war but also showcased the brutal reality of total warfare. For the Germans, the Battle of the Bulge was a disastrous failure that left them with shattered morale and significantly weakened forces. The remnants of the once feared German army, having expended their resources in a futile attempt to reverse the war's course, would no longer be able to mount large-scale offensives. From this point on, the Germans were forced into a defensive posture, retreating further into their homeland, knowing that the inevitable collapse was near. On the other side, the Allied victory in the Ardennes was a critical step toward the final push into Germany. As American, British, and other Allied forces regrouped and continued their advance, they faced a series of increasingly difficult battles, but the momentum had clearly shifted. The Germans were no longer capable of mounting an effective defense against the Allied onslaught. The death knell of Nazi Germany had been sounded, and Berlin was now within reach. The liberation of concentration camps in the spring of 1945 added further urgency to the Allies' mission. The horror of the Holocaust, revealed in the wake of the advancing Allied forces, became another symbol of the necessity of the war effort and the importance of defeating the Nazi regime. For the soldiers who had fought at the Battle of the Bulge, their victory was not just about military triumph, it was about the liberation of the oppressed and the destruction of one of the most brutal regimes in history. The Battle of the Bulge also had a profound effect on the soldiers who survived. Many of the men who had endured the relentless cold, the constant threat of death, and the harrowing challenges of warfare found themselves marked by the experiences they had gone through. The battle had tested their physical and mental limits. For some, the memories of lost friends and the sheer terror of the fighting would never fade. Others struggled with the long-term effects of battle fatigue, a condition that was not fully understood at the time but would later be recognized as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Despite these challenges, the victory in the Ardennes gave the soldiers a sense of purpose and pride. They had faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious, but the cost had been high. As they pushed forward into Germany, the war's end was in sight, but so was the realization that the scars of the conflict would be with them for the rest of their lives. For the German soldiers who had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the retreat was marked by bitterness and confusion. Many of them were forced to abandon their equipment and retreat under fire, leaving behind the tanks and artillery that had once been symbols of Nazi might. The realization that their leaders had led them into a catastrophic offensive was a bitter pill to swallow. As the Allies advanced, the remnants of the German army were shattered, and the final days of the war approached. The Battle of the Bulge had been a desperate attempt to stave off the inevitable, but it ultimately sealed the fate of the Third Reich. Hitler's obsession with reversing the course of the war had led to one final disastrous offensive, one that only hastened the collapse of Nazi Germany. The battle was a last gasp of defiance, but it ultimately served to underscore the futility of the German cause. As the Allies continued their march towards Berlin, the lessons of the Battle of the Bulge were clear. The bravery of the soldiers who had fought in the harsh winter conditions, often outnumbered and surrounded, had been crucial to the Allied success. Their resilience in the face of overwhelming odds showed the world that even in the most dire situations, there was hope. The battle had proven that courage, determination, and unity could overcome the darkest forces of evil. In the months that followed, as the war in Europe came to an end with the fall of Berlin in May 1945 and Hitler's suicide, the legacy of the Battle of the Bulge endured. It had been a brutal and costly engagement, but it had also been a key turning point in the war. The victory not only marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but it also served as a testament to the strength of the human spirit in times of unimaginable hardship. For the soldiers who had fought in the battle, the end of the war was a moment of both relief and reflection. The horrors they had witnessed and the sacrifices they had made would never be forgotten. The Battle of the Bulge had been a defining moment in their lives, and it had changed them in ways that would last forever. They had fought for freedom, for their comrades, and for the survival of the world as they knew it. The war was over, but the legacy of their courage, and the cost of that victory, would remain a part of history for generations to come. As the war in Europe finally came to an end, the legacy of the Battle of the Bulge remained one of the most significant chapters in the story of World War II. The battle had been a monumental clash between two forces, one clinging to a crumbling empire and the other determined to bring it to its knees. It had been a battle of attrition, a brutal test of endurance, and a pivotal moment in the Allied victory. Despite the immense human cost, it also showcased the indomitable will of those who fought in it. For the soldiers who had been on the front lines of the Battle of the Bulge, the memories of the brutal winter, the relentless tank assaults, and the harrowing battles would stay with them forever. Many of the men who had survived the battle carried the physical and emotional scars of the fighting for the rest of their lives. The cold, the isolation, the fear, and the loss of comrades became part of their identity. Yet, even in the darkest moments, they had endured. They had shown the world that, in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and resilience could still prevail. The victory in the Ardennes was a key moment in the final stages of the war, but it was not the end. The Allies' next challenge was to finish the job, pushing into the heart of Germany and ending the Nazi regime once and for all. As the Allies advanced, the Nazi defenses crumbled. Cities were liberated, and the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed to the world. The horrors of war, once again, were made real through the eyes of those who had fought to end it. For the survivors of the Battle of the Bulge, the end of the war was a bittersweet relief. They had won the battle, but the toll it had taken on them and on their comrades was immeasurable. Thousands of men had given their lives in the freezing cold, their sacrifices etched into the history of the war. The battle, though a victory, had been a grim reminder of the brutality of conflict and the high cost of freedom. As the Allied forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler's regime collapsed, and Germany was left in ruins. The surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945 marked the end of the war in Europe, but the cost had been high. The Battle of the Bulge, while a decisive victory, had been a reminder that the war was not won easily. It had taken the bravery and determination of countless soldiers, from the frozen fields of the Ardennes to the heart of Berlin itself, to finally bring the war to an end. In the aftermath, the world would attempt to rebuild, but the scars of the war would last for generations. The lessons of the Battle of the Bulge, and the sacrifices made by the soldiers who fought there, would never be forgotten. It was a reminder of the courage that can emerge in the darkest of times and the price of victory. The battle proved that even in the face of desperate odds, when all seemed lost, the human spirit could still rise, fight, and prevail. For the men who had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the end of the war marked a new beginning. They returned home, some to be greeted as heroes, others to quietly reflect on the friends they had lost. The world would eventually move on, but the memories of that brutal winter in the Ardennes would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The Battle of the Bulge had not just been a military engagement, it had been a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the sacrifices made in the name of freedom, and to the resilience of those who stood their ground when the world seemed on the brink of collapse. It had been a turning point in the war, and for those who had fought in it, it would remain a defining moment in their lives. As time passed, the lessons of the Battle of the Bulge would be passed down through generations. It became not just a story of tanks, soldiers, and strategic victories, but a story of sacrifice, endurance, and the unbreakable will to protect freedom. The battle had been fought on the frozen fields of Belgium, but its legacy would be felt around the world for decades to come, as a reminder of the cost of war and the price of peace.